All right, we are back, and we're getting sort of towards the end of this book, The Legend of Hiram by Manly P. Hall. So, this next part, it's not really entitled Chapter 6, but it just says Epilogue, and it says, In the Temple of Cosmos, the Priest of Ra. And so, right off the bat, it's getting into all this ancient Egyptian stuff. If you ever had any questions, or if anyone ever had any doubts about Freemasonry's connections to ancient Egypt and ancient Atlantis, look no further here. It's all right here in this book. All right, let's continue. What words are there in modern language to describe the great temple of Amun-Ra? Now it stands on the sand of Egypt, a pile of broken ruins, but in the days gone by it rose a forest of plumed pillars holding up roofs of solid sandstone carved into friezes. They spell that Friezes. Not sure if I pronounced that right. Of lotus blossoms and papyri plants by hands long still, colored lifelike by pigments, the secrets of which were lost with the civilizations that discovered them. A checkered board floor of black and white blocks stretched out until it was lost among the wilderness of pillars, and from the massive walls the faces of gods, unnamed, looked down in passive grandeur upon the silent files of priests that kept alight the altar fires whose feeble glow alone lighted the massive chambers through the darkness of Egyptian night. It was weird, impressive scene, and the flickering lights sent strange ghastly forms scurrying among the piles of granite which rose like mighty altars from the darkness below to be lost again in the shadows above. Suddenly a figure appeared from among the shadows, carrying his hand a small oil lamp which cut the darkness like a little star, and brought into strange relief the figure of him who bore it. He appeared to be old, for his long beard and braided hair were quite gray, but his large black eyes shone with the fire seldom even in youth. He was robed from head to foot in blue and gold, and around his forehead was coiled a snake of precious metal, set with jeweled eyes that gave out flashes of light when the flame struck them. Never had the light of Ra's chamber shone on a grander head of more powerful form than that of the high priest of the temple. He was the mouthpiece of the gods and the sacred wisdom of ancient Egypt, and was written in fiery letters on his soul. As he crossed the great room, in one hand the scepter of the priestcraft, and in the other hand a tiny lamp, he was more like a spirit visitor from beyond the mountains of death than a physical being, for his jeweled sandals made no sound, and the sheen from his robes formed a halo of light around his stately form. Down through the silent passageways lined their massive pillars, past the phantom form, down steps lined with kneeling sphinxes, and through avenues of crouching lions, the priest lighted his way, until at last he reached a vaulted chamber of marble, or of the marble floor, of which strange designs were traced in a language long forgotten. Each angle of the many-sided and dimly lighted room was formed by a seated figure carved in stone so massive that its head and shoulders were lost in shadows no eye could pierce. In the center of this mystic chamber stood a great chest. It was some black stone carved with serpents and strange winged dragons. The lid was a solid slab weighing hundreds of pounds, without a handle of any kind, and apparently there was no way of opening it without the use of Herculean powers. The priest leaned over, and with the lamp he carried, lighted the fire upon the altar that stood near, sending shadows of that weird room scurrying into the distant corners. As the flame rose, it was reflected from the great stone faces above, all of which seemed to stare at the black coffer in the center of the room with strange, sightless eyes. The priest raised his serpent-wounded staff and, facing the chest of somber marble, called out in a voice that echoed and re-echoed from every corner of the ancient temple, "Eridamus, come forth." Then a strange thing happened. The heavy slab that formed the cover of the dark ark slowly raised as though unseen hands were lifting it. And there arose from the dark a slim, white-clad figure with his forearms crossed on his chest, or on his breast. It was that of a man of perhaps 30 years, his long black hair hanging on his white-robed shoulders in strange contrast to the seamless garment that he wore. His face, devoid of emotion, was as handsome and immovable as the great face of Amun-Ra that gazed down upon the scene. Silently, Eridamus stepped from the ancient tomb and advanced slowly toward the high priest. When he was about 10 paces from the representative of the gods of earth, he stopped, unfolded his arms, and extended them across his chest in salutation. In one hand he carried a cross with a ring as the upper arm, and this he held out to the priest. Eridamus stood in silence as the high priest, raising his scepter to one of the great stone figures, began an invocation to the sun god of the universe. This finished, he addressed the youthful figure. Eridamus, you seek to know the mystery of creation. You ask that the divine illumination of the thrice greatest, that's Hermes, and the wisdom that for ages has been the one gift of the gods would shower upon mankind be entrusted to you. Of the thing you ask, you little understand, but those who know have said that he who proves worthy may receive the truth. Therefore stand you here today to prove your divine birthright to the teaching that you ask. The priest pronounced these words slowly and solemnly, and then pointed with his scepter to a great dim archway surmounted by a winged globe of gleaming gold. Before thee, up these steps and through these passageways, lies the path that leads to the eye of judgment and the feet of Amun-Ra. Go, and if thy heart be pure as the garment that thou wearest, and if thy motive be unselfish, thy feet shall not stumble, and thy being shall be filled with light. But remember that Typhon and his hosts of death lurk in every shadow, and that death is the result of failure. Eridamus turned and again placed his arms over his breast in the sign of the cross. As he walked slowly through the somber arch, the shadows of the great unknown closed over him who had detected his life to the search for the eternal. The priest watched him until he was lost to sight among the massive pillars beyond the silent span that divided the living from the dead, and then slowly fell on his knees before the gigantic statue of Ra. Raising his eyes to the shadows that through the long night concealed the face of the sun god, he prayed that the youth might pass from the darkness of the temple pillars to the light he sought. It seemed that for a second a glow played around the face of the enormous statue, and a strange hush of peace filled the ancient temple. The high priest felt this, for arising, he relighted his lamp and walked slowly away. His little star of light shone fainter and fainter in the distance, and finally was lost to view among the papyrus blooms of the temple pillars. All that remained was the dying flames on the altar, which burning low sent strange flickering glows over the great stone coffer and the 12 judges of the Egyptian dead. In the meantime, Eridamus, his hands still crossed on his breasts, walked slowly onward and upward until the last ray from the burning altar fire was lost to view among the shadows far behind. Through years of purification, he had prepared himself for the great ordeal, and with a harmonious, purified body and a balanced mind, He wound in and out in a mysterious way among the pillars that loomed about him. As he walked along, there seemed to radiate from his being a faint golden glow which brought dimly into view the pillars as he passed. He seemed a ghostly from amidst a grove of ancient trees. Suddenly the pillars widened out and formed another vaulted room dimly lit by a reddish haze. As Eridamas proceeded, there appeared around him swirling wisps of this scarlet light. First they appeared as swiftly moving clouds, but slowly they took form, and strange misty figures in flowing draperies hovered in the air and held out long swaying arms to his progress. Sheaths of ruddy mist twined about him and whispered soft words into his ears, while weird music, like the voice of storms and the cries of night birds, resounded through the lofty halls. This sounds kind of... I wonder if they're talking about the halls of Amente, which Thoth talks about time and time again in his emerald tablets. That's kind of what this sounds like. I wonder if this is describing the halls of Amente. Still, Eridamas walked on in perfect calm and mastery, his fine spiritual face lined with its raven locks in strange contrast to the luring, sinuous forms that gathered around and tried to stay his progress. Through strange forms beckoned from ghostly archways and soft voices pleaded, he passed steadily on his way, but with one thought in his mind. In parentheses, it says, Lux Fiat, and then it says next to it, let there be light. The ghastly music grew louder and louder until at last it ended in a mighty roar. The very walls shook, the dancing forms swayed like flickering candle shadows, and pleading and beckoning vanished among the carved pillars of the temple. As the temple wall swayed and twisted, Eridamas paused, then in slow, measured step he continued his way on through the darkness, seeking eternally for some ray of light and finding always darker, deeper than before. Suddenly before him loomed another doorway, on each side of which was an obelisk of carved marble, one black and the other white. Through the doorway glowed a dim light, concealed from his eyes by a thin veil of blue silk. Eridamas climbed a series of steps and slowly advanced to the doorway. As he did, so there arose from the ground before him a swirl of lurid mists. In the faint light that it cast from himself, it twisted like some oily gas and filled the entire chamber with a sickening haze. Then out of this mist a gigantic form issued, half man, half reptile. From its bloodshot eyes issued ruddy glows of demon fire, while great clawed hands reached out to enfold and crush the slender figure who confronted it. Eridamas wavered for a single instant as the horrible apparition reached forth, and its size seemed to double in the iridescent fog. Then the white-robed neophyte again slowly advanced, his arms still crossed on his chest. He raised his fine face, illuminated with a divine light, and advanced slowly towards the hideous specter. He reached the menacing form, and for an instant it loomed over him, a towering demon. Suddenly, Eridamas raised his cross he carried and held it up before the monster. As he did so, the crux ansata gleamed with a wondrous golden light, which, striking the oily, lizard-like creature, seemed to dissolve it and turn every particle into golden sparks. As the last of the demon guardians vanished under the rays of the cross, a bolt of lightning flashed through the ancient hallways and, striking the veil that hung between the obelisks, tore it straight down the center and disclosed the room beyond as being a great vaulted chamber with a circular dome dimly lighted by invisible lamps. Eridamas, bearing his now flaming cross, entered the room and, as though by instinct, gazed upward to the lofty dome. There, floating in space many feet above his head, was the great closed eye surrounded by fleecy clouds and rainbow colors. Eridamas gazed long at the wonderful sight, for he knew that it was the eye of Horus, the all-seeing eye of the gods. As he stood there, he prayed that the will of the gods might be made known unto him, and that in some way he might be found worthy to open that closed eye in the living temple of the living God. Suddenly he stood there gazing upward. The eyelid flickered slowly, the great orb opened, and the entire chamber was filled with a dazzling, blinding glare that seemed to burn the very stones with blazing fire and blinding light. Eridamas staggered. It seemed as if every atom of his being was torn and scorched by the strength of the glow. He instinctively closed his eyes, and now he feared to open them, for in that terrific blaze of splendor, it seemed that only blindness would follow his action. Little by little, a strange feeling of peace and calm descended upon him, and at last he dared to open his eyes. He found that the glare was gone, but that entire chamber was alight with a soft, wondrous glow from the mighty eye in the ceiling. He saw that the white robe he had worn had given place to one of living fire, which blazed from every atom in his being, as though from thousands of lesser eyes reflecting from the divine orb above. As his eyes became accustomed to the glow, he saw that he was no longer alone, that he was surrounded by 12 white-robed figures who, bowing before him, held up strange insignias wrought from living gold. As Eridamas looked, all these figures pointed, and as he followed the direction of their hands, he saw a staircase of living light that led far up into the dome and past the eye in the ceiling. In one voice, all of the 12 said, "Yonder lies the way of liberation." Without a moment's hesitation, Eridamas advanced to the staircase, and with feet that seemed to barely touch the steps, he climbed upward and onward into the dawn of the great unknown. At last, after climbing many steps, he reached a doorway that was opened as he neared it, and a great breath of morning air fanned his cheek, and a golden glow of sunshine played among the waves of his dark hair. He stood on the top of a mighty pyramid, before him a blazing altar, and in the distance, far over the great expanse of horizon, the rolling sands of the Egyptian desert reflected the first rays of the morning sun. While the globe of day, a mass of golden fire, rose again out of the eternal east. As Eridamas stood there, a voice that seemed to descend from the very heavens chanted a strange song, and a hand, reaching out as it were from the globe of day itself, placed a snake of wrought gold on the brow of the new initiate. Behold, Khepera, the rising sun, for as he brings the almighty globe of day out of the darkness of night between his claws, so for thee, son of spirit, has risen from the darkness of night, and in the name of the living God we hail thee, priest of Ra. And then at the bottom here it says A.U.M. And that was the end of that epilogue. There's still more in this book. There's one more little part before we get into the next section. Let me read this. It says new title here. It says Masons Awake. Your creed and your craft demand the best that is in you. They demand the sanctifying of your life, the regeneration of your body, the purification of your soul, and the ordination of your spirit. Yours is the glorious opportunity, yours is the divine responsibility. Accept your task and follow in the footsteps of the master masons of the past, who with the flaming spirit of the craft have illuminated the world. You have a great privilege, the privilege of illuminated labor. You may know the ends to which you work, while others must struggle in darkness. Your labors are not to be confined to the tiled lodge alone, for a mason must radiate the qualities of his craft. Its light must shine into his home and into his business, glorifying his association with his fellow men. In the lodge and out of the lodge, the mason must represent the highest fruitage of sincere endeavor. And that was the end of that part. There's still a little bit more in the book. We'll do that in another video. I mean, this is so connected to everything in the Emerald Tablets and Hermes Thoth. I mean, even in the, I think it was in the very little beginning part of the Emerald Tablets of Hermes, where it's Dr. Doriel just talking about the book before they actually get into the translation. And he straight up says that the Great Pyramids in Egypt were initiation, like they were initiation temples, and still are to this day. And right here in this book too, this is exactly what they're describing, is this Eridamus guy being initiated in the giant pyramids and going through these halls, which sounds like the halls of Amenti, and then after the end of his initiation, he's on top of one of the pyramids watching the sunrise. Pretty interesting stuff. All right, we'll continue in the next video.